Forced Sterilization in Nazi Germany by Victoria Guild. Between 1933 and 1939, 300,000 to 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized in Nazi Germany. Considered asocial, the German doctors preyed on the handicapped, alcoholics, biracials, or otherwise different groups of people. To fully understand why the German doctors did what they did, it's important to learn about the history of eugenics. Eugenics started in the late 19th century and was a branch of science that believed that controlled breeding was the best way to create a better society. This idea was taken from Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, which was the beginning of the evolutionary biology. Herbert Spencer, shown on screen, who was alive from 1820 to 1903, coined the term survival of the fittest, not Darwin, who is normally thought of as the creator. Darwin actually took the phrase from Spencer and used it in later publications of his book. The term, however, has become intertwined with the eugenics movement. While Spencer coined survival of the fittest, Francis Galton is the one who came up with the idea of eugenics. He took Charles Darwin's idea, who happened to be Galton's cousin, of evolution and applied it to humans. Galton believed that everyone should be tested in order to see if they should have the right to reproduce. Shown here is a chart showing the different levels one may get on a test designed by Galton. This is one of the most famous pictures surrounding eugenics. It's important to note that eugenics wasn't just a German thought, but was a branch of science being explored all over the world. Forced sterilization stemmed from the eugenics ideas, as it was thought that certain groups of people were not worthy of reproduction as their genes were not good enough. This brings us to Germany in the 1930s. On July 14, 1933, Nazi Germany passed the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases. This document, which is shown on screen, states that anyone suffering from a hereditary disease can be sterilized by a surgical operation if, according to the experience of medical science, there is a high probability that his offspring will suffer from serious physical or mental defects of a hereditary nature. Anyone suffering from any of the following diseases is considered hereditarily diseased under this law. 1. Congenital mental deficiency. 2. Schizophrenia. 3. Manic depression. 4. Hereditary epilepsy. 5. Hereditary St. Vitus dance. 6. Hereditary blindness. 7. Hereditary deafness. 8. Serious hereditary physical deformity. Furthermore, anyone suffering from chronic alcoholism can be sterilized. The first group targeted for sterilization were the mentally and physically handicapped. These groups of people were the easiest to target as they were already in institutions separated from normal society. Although not in a medical institution, these groups of people were ostracized from society in their own ways and therefore thought of as less desirable to the German gene pool. Other groups of people that were sterilized by the Germans were alcoholics, prostitutes, criminals, biracials, and Afro-Germans. This picture shows a propaganda article from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The picture shows children with the words, "Who would want to be responsible for this?" trying to show that there are positives of sterilization and it's not having to deal with crying and handicapped children. Another propaganda article from Germany in the 1930s. This illustrates the popular claim at the time that a hereditarily less desirable person cost the country over 50,000 marks per year, which takes away from the genetically stable people of Germany. Propaganda pictures like these help the public feel better about the forced sterilization of members of their own communities. The medical personnel that performed these sterilizations viewed them as a way to help the lower class get out of poverty. Anita Grossman, a renowned historian in both the categories of women's studies and German life, interviewed doctors and nurses who were in charge of approving sterilizations and performing them. She found that many of the women doctors believed that this was just a better form of birth control. Dr. Lotte Fink even reported to Grossman that while many doctors aim to help and educate women about safe sex, the patients are, and I quote, indifferent, and after a while they disregard any advice we have given. Experience has shown that, particularly with women from the lowest social strata, peace and quiet could only be established after tubal litigation. End quote. Forced sterilization allowed for Germany to be seen as a progressive scientific community, following the latest trends in scientific research. Other world powers, such as the United States, also took part in forced sterilization of civilians. This map shows the states in America that had laws in effect or laws that were pending regarding sterilization in 1935. This picture shows a eugenics society in Georgia in the early 20th century. The eugenic movement could be seen all over the globe, especially in societies where there was a strong divide between people. In Germany, this was the Germans versus everyone not German, and in America, it was white versus black. Posters like this one were seen all over America, calling for the use of forced sterilization. Notice the picture of Uncle Sam right below the words. Sterilization was not just a German idea. This information does not make the numbers of those sterilized in Germany any less alarming, but it puts in context what was happening everywhere, not just in Germany. Along with being a top contender in the scientific community of the world, Nazi Germany also had the perfect cover to exterminate hundreds of thousands of people's bloodlines practically overnight. The overall goal for the Nazis to create the perfect race was easier to reach without having to automatically deport millions of people. If Hitler wanted to do anything other than kill those who he deemed of as lesser, he would have focused on sterilizing the Jews, Roma, and Sinti first, instead of the handicapped, criminal, and asocial Germans. Instead, he focused on making the Germans the strongest genetic group of people possible before going on to kill millions on the Nazis' quest for a perfect society. Before the Nazi regime could go out and conquer other lands, claiming the need for racial purification, they first had to make sure that they were pure within their own borders. This began with the Aryans that were less desirable than others, including the handicapped, the mentally insane, and the criminals. This way, when the Nazis took over new land, they would have a standard to compare themselves with and be able to claim those in the new land as lesser than the Germans, thus in need of extermination. The law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases passed in 1933 plays into the narrative that Hitler planned to kill the Jews all along, as he first targets the people in his own community to purify in order to be able to hold them to a higher standard. This is important as the first group of people he targeted is not the Jews as one would think, but his own people. It is only after the sterilization of hundreds of thousands of Germans that Hitler makes the next step in his plan, the separation of Jews in German society and the eventual deportation of anyone non-Aryan to concentration camps in and around Germany. The first real victims of the Holocaust were those that did not have a voice of their own, either forced to reside in mental institutions or permanently at a hospital for a physical disability. The other groups of people, like the criminals, low-income people, and biracials, were thought of as not worthy enough to take their stories into consideration. It wasn't until after the war began and when Operation T4 took place in 1939 that Hitler made an announcement saying that targeting of the handicapped would be ended. Even after the announcement, the sterilization continued well into the 1940s in secret until the fall of the Nazi regime. The world stage in the 1930s was the perfect storm which allowed for the Nazis to rise to power without much thought. The sterilization of over 300,000 people was thought of as innovative and was envied by researchers in many scientific circles as eugenics was really picking up speed throughout the 20th century. It wasn't until the late 1940s, in the fall of Nazi Germany, that people started to realize the practice of eugenics was not an applicable science and started to move away from it. Forced sterilization was the first step into the mass killings that would eventually take place in and around Germany. Many people don't know about the sterilization of hundreds of thousands, but it is an important part of the Nazi story that must be told in order to try to gain understanding into the Nazi way of thinking. It is also important to remember that forced sterilization was not just a German invention, but it was happening worldwide, including in the United States.